The night swallowed her as she stood before the decaying farmhouse, clutching her swollen belly, every shadow twisting with whispers of the past. Her pale, weary face, etched with lines of fear and suffering, seemed almost not her own, as if time had aged her beyond her years. From the darkness, ghostly children with hollow, unseeing eyes watched silently, their presence both sorrowful and menacing. The wind carried murmurs of forgotten tragedies, the old wood groaned with secrets, and the fog curled like restless spirits. In that frozen moment, innocence, dread, and a haunting story collided, capturing a nightmare trapped in time. The village of Duskwood sat buried between two crooked mountains, a place where the sun rarely stayed long enough to warm the soil, and the fog drifted through the trees like wandering spirits looking for a place to rest. Every home, every stone, every twisting path carried a story from the old world, whispered through generations and kept alive in the crackling silence of winter nights. And yet, among all those tales, some forgotten, some feared, none felt as unsettling as the story that quietly surrounded the young woman known as Alina Varan. She lived at the farthest end of the village, past the broken fence, the leaning spruce trees, and the narrow footpath that dissolved into the woods where even hunters refused to go. Her cabin, a crooked structure from another time, sagged against the hillside as if tired of standing. The roof leaked in the rain, the walls trembled in the wind, and the windows were so fogged over that no one ever knew if she was watching from inside. Alina rarely spoke. She moved like a shadow, quiet and quick, never meeting anyone's eyes for more than a moment. Her thin frame and tired face made her look older than she was, and she wrapped herself in an oversized shawl even in the warm seasons, as if hiding something more than her body. The villagers seldom approached her. They believed the Varans were cursed, strange, secretive people marked by something unnatural in their blood. Some said it was because they kept to themselves for too many generations. Others whispered that their ancestors had made a pact with something in the woods, something that still lived between the trees. Alina tried to ignore the stares and the muttered prayers when she passed by, but she always felt them. She felt them burning into her back like cold needles. Then, one evening as the last of the daylight faded behind thick clouds, everything changed. Old Mrs. Brindle, Alina's nearest neighbor, was returning from the well with a bucket of water when she heard soft footsteps on the path. She turned and saw Alina walking slowly, clutching the shawl around her chest. The wind lifted the edge of the cloth, and for the briefest moment, Brindle saw the unmistakable curve beneath it, a rounded shape at Alina's stomach that had never been there before. The old woman froze. Alina noticed and tugged the shawl tighter, but it was too late. The truth had slipped out. The next morning the rumor had spread across the entire village like wildfire in a field of dry grass. Alina was pregnant, but no one had ever seen her with a man. No one had ever heard her speak to one. No one had even seen a stranger visiting her isolated cabin. The women murmured about it as they fetched water, their voices trembling with a mix of fear and fascination. The men pretended not to care. Yet they gathered near the blacksmith's shop to exchange theories in hushed tones, each more unsettling than the last. The village children whispered about ghosts and forest spirits, imagining terrible shapes lurking near Alina's windows at night. Alina, sensing the shifting air around her, avoided the village entirely. She walked the long way around the fields to gather herbs, her head bowed, her steps unsteady. Her face grew paler with each passing day, and her once bright eyes became shadowed with something like dread. The women who knew childbirth the best observed her from afar and felt something cold settle in their bones. A pregnant woman usually carried a certain softness, a warmth, a glow, but Alina seemed dimmer, smaller, more fragile, as if the life inside her drained her own strength instead of sharing it. Some villagers pitied her, others believed she deserved whatever fate awaited her. After all, they said, the Varans had always been different. They never left the valley, never mixed with other families, never welcomed outsiders. Their bloodline, thick and tangled with secrets, stretched back centuries without a single branch leading outward. But none of that explained how Alina had become pregnant when no one had ever seen her with any man. The mystery dug deeper roots each day. The midwife, Martha Keller, recalled something strange she had witnessed months before. She had seen Elena, standing at the edge of the forest late one evening, staring into the darkness, as if listening to someone whisper her name. There had been no one else there, only the trees swaying under a heavy moon. Elena had not noticed Martha approaching, or perhaps she had, but simply didn't care. She had stood perfectly still, hands resting on her stomach though. It had not yet shown any sign of pregnancy, her face expressionless, her eyes hollow. Martha had found the moment unsettling, but had forced herself to forget it, telling herself Elena was simply grieving over her lonely life. Now, with the rumors swirling, that memory returned with a chill. As days bled into weeks, the villagers found themselves caught between curiosity and fear. The priest visited Elena's cabin once, hoping to offer guidance, but returned pale and unsettled, refusing to speak of what he had seen inside. Children claimed they heard strange sounds coming from her home at night, soft humming, like a lullaby carried by the wind, even though she lived alone. Elena no longer slept. Her neighbors saw the faint glow of a candle in her window every night, until dawn. Her footsteps echoed on the wooden porch long after midnight, pacing back and forth, as if she feared closing her eyes. And beneath her shawl, her stomach grew larger every day. Still, no one dared confront her. The Varans had always been treated with caution. But now the villagers watched Elena like one watches a storm forming on the horizon, quietly, nervously, knowing it may bring destruction. Elena could feel their fear. She felt it every time she walked through the market and conversations stopped mid-sentence. She felt it in the way people avoided meeting her gaze, or crossed themselves when she passed. She felt it most at night, when she sat alone in her cabin, listening to the silence between her heartbeat and the heartbeat within her. And though she never said it aloud, Elena was afraid too. She was afraid of the thing growing inside her, because she knew, deep in her bones, that this child was not like other children. She knew because the dreams had started long before her belly had begun to swell. Dreams full of shadows reaching toward her. Dreams of figures with twisted faces calling her name from beneath the earth. Dreams of a child whose eyes glowed in the dark. She woke from those dreams trembling, clutching her stomach, whispering prayers she had not spoken since she was a girl. But the dreams kept coming. So did the whispers. And each night, the child moved more strongly, more deliberately, as if aware of her fear. As the first snowfall coated the valley, Elena realized something she had tried to deny from the moment. She felt the first flutter inside her. This pregnancy was not a blessing. It was a warning. The Varan family had always been a mystery woven into the very bones of Duskwood, an old whisper that refused to die even as generations grew and faded like mist dissolving into dawn. Their presence lingered in the village like a scent no one could place. Familiar, unsettling, heavy with an unspoken history. Elena had grown up listening to these stories in fragments, catching murmurs from neighbors who lowered their voices as she walked by, hearing children repeat things they didn't fully understand, and sensing the uncomfortable silence that fell whenever her family name was mentioned. The Varans lived on the farthest edges of the valley, tucked away where the mountains hunched over the land, as though guarding something ancient or hiding something shameful. Their house, a sprawling wooden structure that had once been grand, had collapsed in places over the years, its walls buckling under snow and time. Yet the heart of the home remained intact, standing stubbornly in defiance of decay. Elena had wandered its dim hallways as a child, running her fingers over faded portraits whose faces were so alike they could have been reflections of one another: pale skin, sharp features, narrow jaws, wide, set eyes that seemed to follow you wherever you moved. Each portrait felt like a warning rather than a memory. Her mother had never explained why their ancestors all looked so similar, why their family history felt like a circle instead of a branching tree. And whenever Elena asked, she received the same answer: some things are better left where they were buried. The Varans rarely left their land. They worked their own fields, hunted their own game, drew their own water. Outsiders were not welcome, and the family was not known to marry beyond their bloodline. in old tales whispered late at night by villagers, sitting around small fires. The Varans had been described as keepers of the valley, though no one knew what exactly they were keeping. Some claimed the family had once possessed a gift, an ability to read nature, to hear the earth breathe, to sense things that ordinary humans could not. Others claimed that gift had turned into a curse, after too many generations of isolation, twisting their bodies and their minds. Children born into the Varan line were always watched with apprehension. Some were startlingly intelligent, but grew sickly too quickly. Others had strange features, or senses that seemed too sharp, or eyes that glowed faintly when caught in lantern light. A few never lived long enough to speak their first words, carried away by the cold winters that swept through the valley like an unforgiving hand. Despite this, the Varans refused to change. They refused to leave the valley, refused to mix with other families, refused to seek help from the world beyond the mountains. They insisted their lineage must remain pure, untouched, preserved. But preserved for what? No one dared to ask. Elena's grandparents had been the last generation to interact somewhat openly with the villagers, though even they had kept their distance. Her grandfather walked with a slow limp and spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice carried a weight that stilled the air. Her grandmother, a thin woman with colorless eyes, always seemed to observe more than she expressed, as if she lived half in the present and half somewhere else entirely. Elena had been raised under their watchful gaze, their silence becoming her lullaby and her language. She learned early that curiosity was dangerous, questions were discouraged, and wandering into the deeper woods was forbidden. She also learned that her family's past was not something to be rewritten or escaped. It was something to be endured. When Elena turned 16, her grandparents died within weeks of each other. Her grandmother first, slipping away in her sleep, followed by her grandfather, who simply refused to eat after she was gone. Their deaths left Elena alone in the vast, decaying house, surrounded by portraits of people who looked like her, but felt like strangers. She tried to continue as they had taught her. Quiet days, long evenings, no visitors, no attachments. But something inside her had always felt trapped. She watched villagers laugh and work together from afar, longing for connection, but unable to bridge the invisible wall built by generations of fear and superstition. People didn't hate her, they feared what she represented. To them, she was the last branch of a tree that had grown twisted with time, carrying secrets too heavy for anyone to bear. After her grandparents' death, the villagers began to speak more openly about the Varans, believing Elena was too quiet, too withdrawn to pay attention. But she heard everything. She heard the whispers about the bloodline that should have ended long ago, the muttered warnings to keep children away from her land, the stories relayed by older villagers who remembered the Varans when they were children. Some claimed the family had once practiced strange rituals deep in the woods, rituals involving old symbols, burned offerings, and whispered chants meant to appease the valley. Others believed the Varans were simply victims of their own stubbornness, paying the price for living too long in isolation. It was said the valley had shaped them into something else, something different, something that didn't belong anywhere else. Even Elena felt the heaviness in her blood at times. She felt it when the moon hung low and enormous over the mountains, when the nights grew unnaturally quiet, when the air turned electric before a storm. She felt it most when she looked in the mirror and saw features too sharp for her soft nature, eyes that seemed older than her 23 years. Sometimes she thought she saw brief flashes, shadows behind her reflection, movements that ended too quickly to be real. She told herself it was fatigue, imagination, the influence of the stories she had heard growing up. But deep inside, she knew the truth. The Varan blood carried something ancient and restless. When news of her pregnancy spread, the villagers' old fears resurfaced with renewed intensity. They were frightened not just because she was pregnant, but because no one knew how. A woman who never spoke to men, who barely spoke at all, suddenly bearing a child. It felt impossible, it felt wrong. And because it felt wrong, the village turned toward the only explanation they had ever known: the Varan curse. Many believed Elena's unborn child would be the final consequence of generations of isolation and secrecy. Some said the valley had finally decided to reclaim what belonged to it. A few whispered darker theories, ones involving spirits, unseen forces, or the desperate attempts of the Varans to preserve their lineage through unnatural means. Elena could feel the eyes of the entire village on her, even when she stayed hidden in her cabin. She felt it when she gathered water from the stream, when she searched for herbs in the forest, when she walked the narrow path that led back home. She felt their fear in the way they avoided her shadow, crossed the road when she approached, or pretended not to see her at all. But what frightened Elena most was not their fear. It was the realization that she could no longer dismiss their stories as superstition. Because the child inside her did not feel normal. It did not move like a human child. It responded to things she could not hear, to sensations she could not explain. And as the days passed, she began to understand why her ancestors had isolated themselves for so long. They had feared what their bloodline would become. They had feared what they might unleash upon the world, if it ever escaped the valley. Elena knew now that the burden of the Varan legacy lived within her womb, growing stronger each day. And she feared the villagers were right. This child might indeed be the final consequence of a bloodline that never should have continued. This child might be the valley's twisted reflection, shaped by generations of secrets, silence, and choices made long before Elena was born. She could no longer pretend her family's past was just a story. She was carrying it. She was living it. And soon, she would be forced to face whatever the Varan blood had created inside her. The first time Elena felt the child move, it was not the gentle flutter mothers described in old stories, not the soft stirring beneath the skin, like butterfly wings awakening for the first time. It was sharp, deliberate, almost intentional. She had been sitting at her small wooden table, the candle flickering weakly as she tried to read an old journal her grandmother once kept. Winter had wrapped the valley in silence, the kind of silence that swallowed every sound except the distant groan of shifting trees. Then, suddenly, a cold rush swept through her belly, and a movement rippled beneath her skin with such strange precision that the book slipped from her hands and fell onto the floorboards. Elena froze. The room seemed to tighten around her, the walls closing in, the air thickening. It wasn't a kick. It was a push. A controlled, almost curious stretch, as if the child was exploring its small world, pressing its palm outward, searching for something beyond her womb. Her breath caught in her chest, as she pressed her trembling hand against her stomach, feeling a faint, rhythmic tapping. Too steady, too thoughtful, too aware. She leaned back, gripping the sides of the chair until her knuckles turned white, her heart pounding so loudly, she wondered if the child could hear it. The candle's flame flickered violently, bending sideways despite the stillness in the air. Elena whispered to herself that it was only her imagination, a mother's fear manifesting in strange ways, nothing more. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't imagination. She could feel the intent behind the movement. From that moment on, the nights became unbearable. Each sunset brought a new wave of dread, as if darkness awakened something within the child. Elena would lie in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling as shadows stretched and curled like fingers reaching for her. The movements within her grew stronger, faster, more coordinated. Sometimes they came in patterns, as though the child responded to something only it could hear. Other nights, Elena heard faint sounds coming from within herself, soft vibrations, almost like humming, tones too low for human ears, yet she felt them resonate through her bones. On the coldest nights, when frost began crawling across her windows, she sensed something even stranger, the presence of footsteps outside her cabin. Soft, measured steps circling the house, pausing beneath the bedroom window, then continuing. At first, she blamed foxes, deer, or wandering hunters. But the footsteps were too rhythmic, too human. They came and went at the same hours each night, always accompanied by the sensation of the child shifting restlessly, as if reacting to whoever, or whatever, stood outside. One night, near the edge of midnight, Elena awoke to a soft creaking, the unmistakable whisper of someone walking on her porch. Her breath hitched. She lay still, afraid to move, afraid to even blink. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she strained to listen. The footsteps stopped directly outside her window. Silence followed, long, heavy, suffocating. Then the child inside her twisted sharply, curling into a tight ball before stretching violently, as though reaching toward the window. Alina gasped, clutching her stomach, feeling its sudden urge, its unmistakable excitement. She felt the air in the room shift, coldness sweeping through her like a wave. She tried to sit up, but her body felt pinned down by fear. The candle beside her extinguished without wind. The room plunged into darkness. She felt the presence outside, not seen but sensed, pushing against her window, pressing against her mind, calling the child within her in a voice she couldn't hear but could feel. The child responded with a shudder that rippled through her from ribs to spine. Alina screamed, the sound cracking in her throat. The footsteps retreated instantly, melting into the night, leaving behind an echo of something ancient and wrong. The child settled moments later, but Alina lay awake until dawn, shaking, drenched in cold sweat. After that night, Alina became terrified of sleep. She would sit in her rocking chair until the early hours of morning, clutching her stomach as the child rolled and twisted beneath her hands. She lit 3 candles, sometimes 5, praying their flames would protect her, protect the world, from whatever grew inside her. But the candles rarely stayed lit for long. One by one they would flicker, sputter, and die, each extinguishing with a whisper of cold air that made Alina's skin crawl. She began hearing whispers too, not loud, not clear, but soft enough to raise the hairs on her arms. Sometimes they sounded like voices murmuring beneath the floorboards. Other times they came from the walls or the earthen ground beneath her cabin. She told herself it was the wind, the shifting wood, the cracking frost. But in her bones, she knew the truth. These whispers were not from the earth. They came from her bloodline, from the dark history she had never understood. And her child, the child of the Varans, heard them too. Alina started writing everything down in her grandmother's old journal, filling page after page with frantic handwriting. She recorded every strange movement, every whisper, every flicker of light, every moment the candles died. She wrote about dreams that began haunting her. Dreams where her ancestors stood in a circle deep in the forest, their faces too pale, their eyes too large, their mouths open as they chanted words she did not recognize. They held candles that burned blue instead of gold, and beneath their feet, something pulsed in the soil, something alive. In her dreams, they always looked at her with pity, as though she were the one they had been waiting for, the one to carry forward whatever they had begun long ago. She always awoke with tears streaming down her face, her body cold and stiff, her stomach aching. The baby would move violently after those dreams, as though upset by her fear or excited by the memory of what it came from. As weeks passed, Alina grew thinner while her stomach grew heavier, rounder, unnaturally firm. Villagers who glimpsed her from afar noticed her pale skin seemed almost translucent in winter sunlight. The veins beneath it darker, more pronounced. Her eyes had changed too. The irises appeared lighter, almost silver at times, reflecting light in odd ways. When she walked through the forest to gather wood, the birds fell silent, the squirrels froze on branches, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The animals sensed what the villagers could only fearfully imagine. Something inside her was different. Not human. Not fully. Something old. Something tied to the valley's cursed heartbeat. One late evening, as Alina was chopping herbs near the window, she felt an intense pressure in her lower belly, so sudden she collapsed to her knees. The pain was sharp, radiating upward into her chest. She cried out, clutching her stomach, her vision blurring. The child inside her twisted violently, then pressed outward so forcefully that she could see the shape beneath her skin. A hand, small yet disturbingly long-fingered, stretching as if trying to grasp the outside world. Alina screamed, collapsing against the wooden floor as tears soaked her cheeks. The hand withdrew after a few seconds, leaving her gasping for air, trembling uncontrollably. She stared at her belly in horror, as faint ripples danced across her skin, movements too fluid to belong to a human fetus. She crawled to her chair, clutching the journal as a lifeline, her body shaking. She wrote what she had seen, her handwriting barely legible through her trembling fingers. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, the child's movements became more erratic, more powerful. Elena felt her ribs shift under pressure. She felt irregular pulses, not like a heartbeat but like drum beats, slow, deep, almost rhythmic. Sometimes she heard faint echoing sounds inside her, like knocking from beneath the skin. Other times she felt as if the child was listening, pausing its movements whenever footsteps or whispers echoed outside. When storms swept through the valley, the child became restless, thrashing and kicking violently until Elena screamed in agony. When the village bell tolled, whether for a wedding, death, or warning, the child would curl tightly as if trying to protect itself or respond to the sound in its own unknown language. Elena was no longer simply frightened. She was unraveling. She barely slept, barely ate, barely spoke. The villagers noticed her growing fragility, but kept their distance, afraid of getting too close to the Varan curse. Only the priest dared approach her cabin again, but when he knocked on her door and she opened it slightly, he stepped back in alarm. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting something ancient, something not entirely her own. He muttered a blessing under his breath and left without entering, convinced that whatever dwelled inside her was far beyond his prayers. Some nights, Elena wondered if she would survive the birth. Other nights, she wondered if the valley would survive the child. She tried to talk to it, placing her hand on her stomach, whispering to it softly, pleading with it to be still, to be gentle, to be human. But the child only responded with slow, deliberate movements that felt more like acknowledgments than comfort. It understood her. It heard her. It felt her fear, and perhaps, in its own way, it fed on it. The valley itself seemed to change as her pregnancy progressed. The fog grew thicker, clinging to the ground like a living thing. The forest grew quieter, its branches hanging lower, as though burdened by an unseen weight. The villagers began reporting strange sightings, shadows moving through the woods at night, blue lights flickering between the trees, the distant hum of voices echoing from nowhere. Children woke from nightmares, screaming about the pale boy in the woods, even though the child had not yet been born. And always, beneath the surface of everything, was the sense of something watching, listening, waiting. Elena felt it too, every moment of every day, the child's awareness, the valley's breath, the weight of her bloodline. She could no longer tell where her fear ended and the child's presence began. She was no longer simply carrying a life. She was carrying a legacy, a curse, a culmination of centuries of choices wrapped into one being. And deep inside her womb, the child continued to grow stronger, more eager, more restless. It was waiting for the moment it would finally meet the world. And the world, though it did not yet know it, was bracing for the moment the child would arrive. The news about the mysterious pregnancy spread quietly at first, creeping through the community like smoke slipping under doors, curling into places where it didn't belong. People whispered behind closed curtains, murmured in small clusters outside the bakery, exchanged glances whenever they saw Rosemary walking to the well with her head lowered and her belly growing each week. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared to say it aloud. The town had always been a place where secrets were buried deep, under floors, under memories, under generations. But this one was different. It was too large, too strange, too terrifying to stay hidden for long. When Rosemary began avoiding the village entirely, retreating deeper into the crumbling farmhouse at the edge of the forest, the silence around her thickened. The house itself, old, sagging, nearly eaten by moss, became a symbol of whatever monstrous truth was being kept inside. People who passed by claimed they heard noises at night, low groans drifting through the fog, the creaking of the porch even when no one was standing on it, and sometimes a whisper that sounded like a child's voice, long before any child should have existed. The villagers told themselves it was the wind, or the old boards contracting in the cold, but deep inside they knew better. Rosemary spent most days in her dim bedroom, where the only light came through a dusty lace curtain that trembled each time the wind pushed against the broken window frame. Her pregnancy had taken a strange turn. Instead of looking healthy, she grew paler, weaker, her eyes sinking deeper into their sockets, as if the life inside her was feeding off her strength more aggressively than any normal child should. Some days she felt the baby move not like gentle kicks, but like frantic trembling, twisting, as if it wanted more space than her body could offer. Other times, there was silence, an unnatural stillness that terrified her more than pain ever could. She would sit for hours holding her belly, whispering to it, pleading with it to calm down, to stop whatever unnatural thing it was doing. She knew this wasn't normal. She knew this wasn't right. But she didn't know how to stop it. Her mother, fragile and half, mad from her own past, tried to comfort her, but she was too consumed by fear to be of real help. She often stared into the dark corners of the room, as if something stood there watching them. Sometimes she muttered words that didn't make sense, fragments of family history, warnings about what happens when blood stays too close too long. Rosemary didn't understand at first. But as her body weakened and the days grew heavier, she began to suspect that her mother's ramblings were more than just the remnants of a failing mind. They might be echoes of a truth too disturbing to face fully. The nights were the worst. Rosemary would lie awake, sweating despite the cold, listening to the strange sounds inside her own body. It wasn't just movement, it was shifting, like bones repositioning themselves, like something adjusting itself to fit in a space it wasn't designed for. She often woke gasping, clutching her sheets, certain she had felt fingers pressing from the inside, tiny but disturbingly strong. Every night she could swear the thing inside her was growing faster than it should, developing too quickly, becoming too aware. She even began to dream, dreams she didn't want to remember. Shadows standing over her bed, whispering in voices that sounded like her father's, her grandfather's, and men she'd never met but somehow recognized. Dreams where the forest outside the farmhouse was alive, watching her, breathing with her. Dreams where the child inside her spoke without speaking, telling her that its arrival would not be like other births. It would be something else, something the world wasn't ready to meet. Every morning she woke feeling older than the night before, her body aching as though she'd lived a lifetime in her sleep. There were moments when Rosemary almost convinced herself to run, to flee the house, the forest, the village, everything. But she couldn't. Her body wouldn't allow it. Her legs trembled when she tried to stand. Her breath hitched after just a few steps, and her vision blurred so often she feared she might collapse before she even reached the road. More than that, something else held her back, something deeper and hard to define. A sense that the child inside her didn't want her to leave. There were times she felt as though it controlled her, guiding her movements subtly, deciding when she could rest and when she must stay awake. When she felt fear rise, the child would kick sharply, as if correcting her, reminding her who truly held power. This wasn't normal motherhood. This felt like possession, ownership. As if she was no longer a mother carrying a child, but a vessel carrying something that had chosen her for a purpose she didn't understand. The few villagers brave enough to visit the farmhouse, mostly out of pity or curiosity, didn't stay long. They'd knock, step inside cautiously, and within minutes find an excuse to leave. One woman claimed that Rosemary's eyes looked different now. Glassy, distant, as if she were looking through people instead of at them. Another swore she heard whispering in the house, even when no one else was around. The priest, after one short visit, refused to return altogether. "There's something in that house," he said quietly afterward, his face pale. "Something older than sin." His words spread faster than rumors usually did. Soon, even those who once pitied Rosemary began avoiding the farmhouse entirely. No one wanted to be near whatever was growing inside her. Inside the house, time felt distorted. Days bled into nights. Weeks passed but felt like hours. Rosemary lost track of everything except the relentless progression of her pregnancy. She stopped marking days on the calendar. She stopped asking for help. She stopped hoping. Her mother, sensing the growing danger, tried desperately to convince her to go somewhere, anywhere, before it was too late. But Rosemary could only shake her head, exhausted and resigned. "He won't let me leave," she whispered once, terrified by the words even as she spoke them. When her mother asked who he was, Rosemary only cried and pressed her hands to her stomach, unable or unwilling to explain. One stormy evening something changed. Rosemary felt a sharp, tearing pain that stole her breath and dropped her to her knees. It wasn't time. Not yet, not according to the doctor's calculations. But the child didn't seem to care about time or rules or biology. It wanted out. It wanted to be born. The pain came in waves, violent and unnatural, making her body convulse in ways that no human body should. Her mother rushed to her side, panicking, calling out her name, but Rosemary could barely hear her. All she could hear was a low humming sound inside her skull, a vibration that felt like it was coming from the baby itself, a sound that seemed almost like laughter. As the storm raged outside, lightning cracking across the sky in jagged lines, Rosemary screamed. The house trembled. The forest seemed to shudder, and in that agonizing moment, she realized that whatever was coming into the world that night wasn't just a child. It wasn't even fully human. It was something born of secrets, of bloodlines twisted beyond recognition, of sins repeated so many times they had become a curse embedded in flesh. And now it was too late to stop it. The birth had begun, and the world, though unaware, was about to face the arrival of something it was never meant to witness. The storm outside continued to roar, as if the sky itself were splitting apart, and inside that decaying farmhouse, Rosemary felt her world collapsing with it. The pain surged through her in violent waves, each one stronger than the last, each one threatening to tear her consciousness away. Her fingers dug into the wooden floor, splinters piercing her skin, but she could barely feel it over the pulsing agony radiating from her body. Sweat dripped down her temples, her breaths came in ragged gasps, and her vision flickered in and out like a dying lantern. Her mother hovered helplessly beside her, trembling with fear, whispering prayers that sounded broken and fragmented, as though she didn't believe they would help. The house groaned with every gust of wind. The windows rattled, the doors shuddered, and shadows moved across the walls like dark hands reaching for them. Rosemary's scream tore through the air again, raw and animalistic, a sound she didn't recognize as her own. She felt the life inside her pushing, twisting, forcing its way into the world with a strength no infant should possess. And then, in a moment so sudden she almost didn't realize it had happened, the pain paused. Her body went still. The storm seemed to quiet, just for a heartbeat. The silence was heavy, unnerving, as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then Rosemary heard it, a sound so soft it might have been mistaken for wind at first. A low, rasping inhale. A breath, but it didn't sound like a newborn's breath. It was deeper, older, as though something ancient had taken its first taste of air, after centuries of waiting. Her mother stepped back instinctively, horror widening her eyes, her hand flying to her mouth. On the floor beside Rosemary, wrapped in the torn remains of a blanket, was the child. At first glance, Rosemary wasn't even sure it was breathing. Its skin was a pale bluish, gray, not the warm pink of a human newborn. Its limbs were too thin, its fingers long and bony, curling and uncurling with eerie precision. But it was the face, God the face, that made Rosemary's blood freeze. The baby's eyes opened slowly, deliberately, and they were not the eyes of an infant. They were far too aware, too focused. They stared at Rosemary with a cold, unsettling recognition, as if it had known her long before this moment, long before its creation, long before she even existed. Those eyes held something impossible, an intelligence that felt wrong, unnatural, inherited not through life but through generations of twisted bloodlines. And when the baby blinked, its eyelids moved in a way that made Rosemary's stomach twist. Too slow, too deliberate, almost reptilian. Rosemary's mother stumbled backward, her face pale as ash. This is not a child," she whispered, voice shaking violently. She crossed herself again and again, her breath hitching in terrified sobs. Rosemary wanted to move toward the baby, to pick it up, to cradle it, her instincts urging her to protect what she had brought into the world. But another part of her, a deeper instinct she didn't understand, kept her frozen in place. Something inside her screamed for her to run, to leave the house, to leave the child, to escape before it fully understood the world around it. She couldn't explain the fear. She had never felt anything like it. It wasn't fear of harm. It was fear of what the child was. Fear of what it knew. Fear of the past it represented. A past she didn't fully know, but had always felt lingering in the shadows of her family history. The child let out a sound. Not a cry, but a low humming vibration. Like the noise she had heard in her skull for weeks leading up to the birth. The humming filled the room, vibrating through the floorboards and into her bones. Rosemary's mother clapped her hands over her ears and backed into the corner, shaking uncontrollably. Rosemary, still weak and shaking, reached out a trembling hand toward the child without understanding why. The baby's humming softened, almost as if it responded to her gesture. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the child into her arms, and as she did, she felt something shift inside her. A sensation like a cold hand wrapping around her heart. The baby leaned its face closer to hers, its breath cold against her cheek, and then it smiled. That small, unnatural smile broke something inside Rosemary's mother. She screamed, a sound of pure terror, and rushed forward, trying to snatch the baby away. But Rosemary tightened her hold, pulling back, reacting with a speed and strength she didn't know she possessed. Her mother froze, stunned, the scream dying in her throat as she stared at Rosemary's eyes. They had changed. They were darker, deeper, almost matching the child's uncanny gaze. "Don't touch him," Rosemary said, though her voice didn't sound entirely like her own. Her mother stumbled back, horrified. She realized then that the curse, the one whispered through generations, the one rooted in decades of secrecy and inbreeding, had not just created a monstrous child. It had taken Rosemary too. The connection between mother and newborn was not natural. It was something older, something embedded in their bloodline, something hungry. Her mother tried to speak, to warn her, to beg her daughter to understand the danger. But Rosemary seemed entranced, her attention consumed entirely by the eerily calm infant in her arms. The storm outside began to intensify again, thunder shaking the walls, lightning filling the room with violent flashes of white. The baby blinked with each flash, almost fascinated by the electric bursts of light. As the minutes passed, Rosemary's strength returned in a way that defied logic. She stood up without assistance, holding the child firmly. Her mother watched in horror as Rosemary moved toward the window, the baby cradled close to her chest. But there was something different in the way she walked. Her movements were too smooth, too controlled, as if she were being guided by something unseen. She whispered to the child in low, strange tones, words her mother couldn't understand, words that didn't belong to any language spoken in the village. Outside, the wind howled and the forest swayed violently, branches thrashing against each other like battling limbs. It felt as though the entire world was reacting to the birth, acknowledging it, fearing it. Then Rosemary's mother realized something truly terrifying. The baby wasn't just watching the storm, it was responding to it. Each rumble of thunder seemed to sync with the infant's breathing. Each gust of wind strengthened when the child let out that low, vibrating hum. It was as though the newborn was communicating with the world outside, influencing it, commanding it. Rosemary continued to whisper to it, her voice growing quieter, deeper, blending into the storm's roar in a way that didn't sound human. The house shook harder, dust falling from the ceiling, the walls creaking under the pressure of supernatural forces converging around them. Rosemary's mother crawled toward her daughter on trembling hands and knees, pleading through her tears, begging her not to let this thing control her. But Rosemary didn't turn. She didn't acknowledge her. She only stared into the storm as if seeing something, or someone, calling to her from the forest beyond. Suddenly, the door of the farmhouse blew open with a violent crash, the wind howling inside like a living creature. The candle flames blew out instantly, plunging the room into near darkness except for the lightning flashing outside. Rosemary turned slowly toward the open doorway, her eyes glowing faintly in the intermittent bursts of light. She walked forward, stepping out into the storm, the child held tightly against her chest. Her mother screamed after her, trying to stand, trying to chase her, but her legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the floor. She could only crawl to the threshold, reaching out helplessly as she watched her daughter disappear into the darkness and rain. The wind swallowed Rosemary's silhouette, her white nightgown whipping violently behind her like tattered wings. The forest seemed to open for her, branches bending as she passed, the trees groaning as though acknowledging the arrival of something they had been waiting for. The storm followed her, circling her like a protective shroud. Her mother sobbed, calling her name again and again until her voice cracked. But Rosemary never turned back. She walked deeper into the forest, her steps steady, her body illuminated only by flashes of lightning. And then, as quickly as it had begun, the storm quieted. The rain softened to a drizzle. The thunder drifted away. Silence returned, eerie and hollow. When morning finally came, the villagers found the farmhouse door still open, swaying gently in the breeze. They searched the house, the yard, and eventually the forest. But there was no sign of Rosemary, no footprints, no torn clothing, no cries for help. The forest floor looked untouched, as if no one had walked through it in years. Her mother sat on the porch, rocking back and forth, whispering Rosemary's name in a broken voice, her eyes vacant. When the villagers asked her what happened, she told them the truth. They didn't believe her. They said she was mad with grief. They said she imagined the monstrous child. They said Rosemary must have run away during the storm. But deep down, every villager felt the unease, the silent dread creeping inside them. Not because they believed her, but because part of them feared she might not be lying. Over the following days, strange things happened in the forest. Animals refused to go near its heart. Birds fell silent. Children woke screaming at night, claiming they heard a baby crying in the distance. Some villagers swore they saw a pale figure wandering between the trees, carrying something small wrapped in cloth. None dared to investigate. None dared to speak openly of it. The forest became a place of fear, a place no one entered anymore. And somewhere in that vast, ancient silence, Rosemary moved through the shadows with her child. No longer entirely human herself, bound to something older, darker, and more powerful than anyone in the village could comprehend. The curse had finally completed its cycle. The most inbred child ever born had come into the world, and the world would never be the same again.